In the winter of 1891, Territorial Inspector Thomas Hartwell arrived at the Whitmore Charity School for orphan children in the remote Montana wilderness to investigate reports of missing students. What he found in the underground classrooms beneath the school would force the territorial government to seal all records for over 80 years and declare the entire facility unsuitable for human habitation. The children who survived spoke of graduation ceremonies where students simply vanished, of moral examinations that ended in screams, and of their beloved headmaster, Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, who claimed his educational experiments were preparing them for a better world. Tonight, we're revealing the contents of those sealed territorial files and the true nature of Dr. Whitmore's pedagogy of pain. Before we descend into the darkness of the Whitmore School, remember that this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the hidden horrors of America's past that others refuse to acknowledge. If you're ready to face these forbidden truths, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. This community is built for true seekers of buried history, and we want to know where our fellow investigators are located. Now let's journey into the Montana wilderness, where education became experimentation and children learned lessons no soul should ever have to endure. The foundation of Achoara, the story begins not with screams echoing through stone corridors, but with the noble intentions of a man who believed he could reshape human nature itself through revolutionary educational methods. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Montana Territory in 1887, carrying impeccable credentials from Harvard Medical School and Yale's Department of Moral Philosophy. At 34, he possessed the kind of intellectual charisma that made territorial officials eager to support his ambitious plan: establish a boarding school for orphaned children that would serve as a laboratory for advanced educational techniques. Site he chose for his experiment sat in a valley 40 miles northwest of Helena, isolated enough to ensure privacy for his work, but accessible enough to attract the attention of Eastern philanthropists who funded progressive education initiatives. The Whitmore Charity School for Orphan Children opened its doors in September 1887 with 12 students and a mission statement that promised to transform the neglected waifs of the frontier into productive citizens through scientific application of moral and intellectual development. What the philanthropists funding Whitmore's work didn't know was that his departure from Harvard hadn't been voluntary. Dr. Whitmore had been quietly dismissed following allegations of conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on medical students. His research had focused on what he called moral malleability, the theory that human conscience could be systematically broken down and rebuilt through carefully applied psychological pressure. The allegations were serious enough to destroy his academic career, but not severe enough to result in criminal charges. Harvard's administration had been content to let him disappear quietly into the Western Territories, where his questionable methods would be someone else's problem. The original school building was impressive. By frontier standards, a 3-story stone structure with dormitories, classrooms, and administrative offices. But it was the construction that began immediately after the school's opening that revealed Whitmore's true intentions. Working with a crew of carefully selected laborers who were paid exceptionally well for their silence, he began excavating beneath the main building. The official explanation was that the underground chambers would provide storm shelters and additional storage for the harsh Montana winters. The reality was far more sinister. Whitmore was creating a laboratory for human experimentation, designed with the same attention to detail that universities applied to their anatomy theaters and research facilities. The underground complex consisted of 5 main chambers connected by narrow corridors that could be sealed from the outside. Each room was equipped with specialized furniture, restraining chairs, observation platforms, and recording stations where Whitmore could document his experiments with scientific precision. The walls were lined with soundproofing materials to prevent screams from reaching the surface, while carefully designed ventilation systems ensured that subjects remained conscious throughout their ordeals. By 1888, the Whitmore School had gained a reputation throughout the territory as a remarkable success story. The children who'd arrived as street orphans and abandoned waifs had been transformed into well-behaved, articulate young people who impressed visitors with their knowledge and manners. Territorial officials pointed to the school as proof that proper education could overcome any disadvantage of birth or circumstance. What they didn't realize was that this transformation had been achieved through systematic psychological torture that broke down the children's natural resistance and rebuilt their personalities according to Whitmore's specifications. The well-behaved students they admired were actually traumatized victims who'd learned that obedience was the only way to survive their headmaster's educational experiments. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of letters that never arrived. Parents who'd surrendered children to the school, siblings who'd been separated during placement, and distant relatives who'd maintained correspondence with students reported that their letters went unanswered. When they inquired about visiting, they were told that the school's educational methods required complete separation from outside influences. During the formation period, that could last several years, this isolation wasn't accidental. Whitmore had learned from his Harvard experience that successful experimentation required complete control over his subjects' environment. The underground chambers weren't just laboratories. They were prisons designed to ensure that no outside influence could interfere with his work. The children who entered the Whitmore School quickly learned that their previous lives had ended completely. They were assigned new names, new identities, and new histories that erased their connections to family and community. Those who resisted this transformation were taken to the underground chambers for specialized moral instruction. That continued until their resistance was completely broken. By 1889, the school's enrollment had grown to 45 students, but the actual number of children who'd been admitted was closer to 60. The discrepancy was explained by transfers to other institutions and early graduations for students who'd completed their moral development ahead of schedule. In reality, those missing children had become subjects in Whitmore's most extreme experiments, studies that explored the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. The true horror of the horror of the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. The true horror of the absolute endurance. Whitmore School lay not in the physical abuse that occurred in the underground chambers, though that was certainly present. The real evil was in the systematic destruction of human identity that Whitmore had perfected. His experiments weren't designed to educate children. They were designed to prove that human personality could be completely erased and rebuilt according to his specifications. Dr. Whitmore's educational philosophy was outlined in detailed journals that he maintained throughout his time at the school. These documents, recovered after his disappearance, revealed a mind that had completely abandoned any pretense of moral restraint in pursuit of scientific knowledge. He wrote with the detached precision of a researcher documenting laboratory procedures, describing the psychological breakdown of children as if they were specimens in a biological experiment. The moral development of the child, Whitmore wrote, in one entry, requires the complete destruction of pre-existing personality structures. Like a surgeon who must first cut away diseased tissue before healthy growth can occur, the educator must systematically eliminate all traces of the child's former identity before proper moral instruction can begin. His methods for achieving this moral surgery were documented with clinical precision. Children who showed signs of homesickness were subjected to memory realignment therapy, in specially designed chambers where they were forced to recite fabricated histories of their past until they could no longer distinguish between truth and fiction. Those who asked about their families were given empathy reduction treatments that gradually eliminated their ability to form emotional attachments. The most disturbing aspect of Whitmore's experiments was their apparent success. Children who underwent his treatments did indeed display the behavioral modifications he desired. They became obedient, articulate, and apparently well-adjusted, but they also became something less than human. The psychological processes that normally govern conscience, empathy, and individual identity had been systematically removed and replaced with artificial constructs designed to serve Whitmore's vision of perfect moral development. The transformation was so complete that even territorial inspectors who visited the school were impressed by the results. The students they observed displayed remarkable discipline, extensive knowledge, and apparent contentment with their educational experience. What they didn't realize was that these children had been psychologically conditioned to present exactly the facade that Whitmore wanted outsiders to see. The facade began to crack in the summer of 1890 when a supply wagon driver reported seeing children in the school's courtyard who appeared to be moving wrong, walking with the mechanical precision of wind-up toys, rather than the natural movements of healthy youngsters. When questioned about this observation, territorial officials dismissed it as the imagination of an uneducated frontiersman who'd probably been drinking. But other reports began accumulating. Neighboring ranchers spoke of strange sounds emanating from the school grounds during the night, not the usual noise of children at play, but rhythmic chanting that sounded more like incantations than educational recitation. Supply deliveries revealed that the school was ordering unusual quantities of restraining equipment, medical supplies, and materials typically used in scientific experimentation rather than traditional education. The most disturbing report came from Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, a visiting physician who'd been invited to examine the school's health procedures. Dr. Mackenzie noted that while the children appeared physically healthy, they displayed psychological symptoms consistent with severe trauma. They spoke in monotone voices, avoided eye contact, and showed no signs of the emotional range typical of normal childhood development. When she attempted to conduct private interviews with individual students, she was informed that the school's educational methods required constant supervision to prevent regression to previous behavioral patterns. The children themselves seemed incapable of normal conversation, responding to questions with rehearsed answers that revealed nothing about their actual thoughts or feelings. Dr. Mackenzie's report, filed with territorial authorities in October 1890, recommended immediate investigation of the school's methods. She wrote, "The students at the Whitmore School display behavioral patterns consistent with systematic psychological abuse. Whatever educational techniques are being employed, they appear to be destroying the children's natural development rather than enhancing it." The investigation that should have followed Dr. Mackenzie's report was delayed by bureaucratic processes and political considerations. The Whitmore School had powerful supporters among territorial officials who didn't want to admit that their model educational institution might be a cover for child abuse. The delay would prove fatal for the children who remained trapped in Whitmore's underground laboratories. The winter of 1890 to 1891 was particularly harsh in Montana Territory, with blizzards that cut off communication between remote settlements for weeks at a time. The isolation that had always been part of the Whitmore School's design became absolute, allowing Dr. Whitmore to accelerate his experiments without fear of outside interference. It was during this period that he began what his journals called the final phase of his research, experiments designed to test the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. The underground chambers, which had previously been used for individual treatments, were modified to accommodate group sessions where multiple children could be subjected to simultaneous psychological manipulation. The techniques employed during these sessions were described in Whitmore's journals with the same clinical detachment he'd used throughout his research. Children were subjected to sensory deprivation, forced to witness the psychological breakdown of their peers, and compelled to participate in activities designed to eliminate their remaining traces of human empathy. The most horrifying aspect of these experiments was their educational framework. Whitmore continued to present his torture sessions as advanced pedagogical techniques, justifying every atrocity as necessary for the children's moral development. The students were told that their suffering was evidence of their previous moral corruption, and that only complete psychological breakdown could prepare them for reconstruction as properly functioning human beings. By February 1891, the psychological pressure had reached levels that even Whitmore's most thoroughly conditioned subjects couldn't endure. The carefully maintained facade of educational success began to collapse as children started displaying behaviors that couldn't be explained by any legitimate teaching method. Some students stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through repetitive gestures that seemed to serve no purpose other than self-soothing. Others developed physical symptoms of extreme stress, hair loss, persistent tremors, and eating disorders that suggested their psychological trauma had begun manifesting in physical breakdown. Most disturbing were the students, who'd apparently reached the final stage of Whitmore's conditioning process. These children displayed complete emotional detachment, speaking about their experiences in the underground chambers with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to discuss the weather. They showed no distress when describing torture sessions, and no empathy when witnessing the suffering of other students. The transformation was so complete that they seemed to have become extensions of Whitmore's will rather than independent human beings. They assisted in the punishment of other students, reported on conversations and behaviors that might indicate resistance to the educational process, and participated in the underground experiments with the detached efficiency of laboratory assistants. It was one of these thoroughly conditioned students who provided the first detailed information about what was actually happening in the Whitmore School's underground chambers. Timothy Morrison, a 12-year-old boy who'd been admitted to the school in 1888, had undergone such complete psychological reconstruction that he was capable of describing the most horrific experiences without any emotional response. When territorial Inspector Thomas Hartwell finally arrived at the school in March 1891. Timothy's matter-of-fact account of the underground experiments provided the roadmap that would expose the full extent of Whitmore's crimes. The investigation begins. Thomas Hartwell had been a territorial inspector for 8 years, investigating everything from corrupt land deals to illegal mining operations. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would discover at the Whitmore Charity School for Orphan Children. The assignment had seemed routine when he received orders from the territorial capital in Helena. Dr. Mackenzie's report had raised concerns about the school's educational methods, and several ranchers had complained about strange noises emanating from the facility during winter months. Hartwell's job was to conduct a standard inspection, verify that the school was operating within territorial guidelines, and file a report that would either validate or address the concerns that had been raised. The journey to the school took 3 days through mountain passes still choked with late winter snow. Hartwell's first impression of the facility was entirely positive. The buildings were well maintained, the grounds were orderly, and the staff who greeted him displayed the professional courtesy he'd come to expect from legitimate educational institutions. Dr. Whitmore himself was an impressive figure who radiated the kind of intellectual authority that territorial officials found reassuring. His credentials were impeccable, his knowledge of educational theory was extensive, and his dedication to the welfare of his students seemed genuine. During their initial meeting, He spoke eloquently about the challenges of educating children who've been damaged by neglect and abandonment, explaining his methods as necessary adaptations to the special needs of his student population. The first day of inspection proceeded according to standard protocol. Hartwell observed classes, reviewed administrative records, and interviewed staff members about their experiences at the school. Everything he saw supported the school's reputation as a model institution. The students were well-behaved, articulate, and apparently content with their educational experience. But there were subtle anomalies that began to accumulate in Hartwell's mind like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. The students' responses to his questions seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Their movements displayed a mechanical precision that suggested rigid training rather than natural childhood development. Most disturbing was their complete lack of emotional expression. They smiled when appropriate, spoke when addressed, and demonstrated their knowledge when requested. But they showed no signs of the curiosity, mischief, or individual personality that characterized normal children. Hartwell's suspicions were further aroused by the school's physical layout. The main building was larger than necessary for the current enrollment, with several areas that were designated as storage or maintenance spaces, but were kept locked and off-limits to inspection. When he asked about these restricted areas, Dr. Whitmore explained that they contained sensitive equipment and materials that required special handling. The turning point came during his second day at the school when Hartwell encountered Timothy Morrison during a break between classes. The 12-year-old boy approached him with the same mechanical precision that characterized all the students' movements. But his words revealed information that shattered the facade of educational normalcy. "Inspector Hartwell," Timothy said in a voice devoid of emotion, "Dr. Whitmore would like you to know that my moral development has been completed through specialized instruction in the purification chambers. I have been selected to assist with your tour of the underground facilities because I no longer experience distress when observing the educational techniques employed for students who require intensive moral reconstruction." The casual mention of purification chambers and underground facilities contradicted everything Hartwell had been told about the school's educational methods. When he asked Timothy to explain what he meant, the boy's response was delivered with the same emotionless precision that characterized all his communication. Students who display resistance to moral instruction are taken to the chambers beneath the school for specialized treatment. The process involves the systematic removal of corrupted personality structures and their replacement with properly ordered moral frameworks. I underwent this process during my second year at the school and can now assist Dr. Whitmore in its application to other students. Timothy's description of his own psychological torture was delivered without any sign of distress or emotional response. He spoke about having his corrupted personality structures removed as if describing a routine medical procedure. The complete absence of normal human emotion in his account was more disturbing than any display of trauma would have been. When Hartwell pressed for more details about these underground chambers, Timothy explained that they were part of Dr. Whitmore's advanced educational methodology. Students who showed signs of homesickness, disobedience, or attachment to their previous lives were subjected to memory realignment therapy until these problematic behaviors were eliminated. The process was described as necessary for their moral development and ultimate benefit. The boy's matter-of-fact description of systematic psychological abuse convinced Hartwell that the school's educational methods were far more extreme than anything he'd been told. He demanded immediate access to the underground facilities that Timothy had mentioned, but Dr. Whitmore insisted that such access would be disruptive to ongoing educational procedures and potentially dangerous for students who were undergoing sensitive treatments. The confrontation between inspector and headmaster revealed the first cracks in Whitmore's carefully maintained facade of educational respectability. When pressed about his methods, his responses became increasingly defensive, and his explanations more elaborate. He spoke about the unique challenges of educating children who'd been damaged by abandonment and neglect, claiming that conventional teaching methods were insufficient for students who required complete psychological reconstruction. These children arrive at our institution with personality structures that have been corrupted by their previous experiences, Whitmore explained with the pedantic precision of a professor delivering a lecture. Traditional educational methods assume a foundation of moral development that simply doesn't exist in subjects who've been damaged by abandonment, abuse, or exposure to criminal environments. Our techniques are designed to address these fundamental deficiencies by removing corrupted psychological patterns and replacing them with properly ordered moral frameworks. Hartwell's demand for immediate access to the underground chambers was met with further resistance. Dr. Whitmore claimed that the facilities were currently being used for intensive treatment sessions that couldn't be interrupted without causing psychological harm to the students involved. He offered to provide access the following day, after the current treatment cycle had been completed. The delay was unacceptable to Hartwell, who recognized that he was dealing with something far more serious than educational misconduct. His 8 years of experience as a territorial inspector had taught him to recognize the signs of systematic abuse, and everything he'd observed at the Whitmore School suggested that children were being subjected to treatment that went far beyond legitimate educational discipline. His decision to force immediate access to the underground chambers was influenced by Timothy Morrison's final comment before returning to his supervised activities. The boy had mentioned that several students were currently undergoing intensive moral reconstruction in the purification chambers, and that their treatment would continue until their resistance to the educational process had been completely eliminated. The casual reference to ongoing torture sessions convinced Hartwell that children were in immediate danger. He informed Dr. Whitmore that he was exercising his authority as a territorial inspector to examine all facilities immediately, and that any attempt to prevent access would result in criminal charges for obstruction of official duties. The confrontation that followed revealed the true nature of the Whitmore School's educational philosophy. Dr. Whitmore's mask of professional courtesy fell away completely, replaced by the arrogant certainty of someone who convinced himself that his crimes were justified by their educational value. "You don't understand what we're accomplishing here," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the fervor of a true believer. "These children were human refuse before they arrived at our institution. Abandoned, neglected, corrupted by exposure to the worst elements of frontier society. We're not abusing them. We're saving them from the psychological damage that would have made them criminals or deviants if left untreated." The headmaster's justification for his methods revealed the complete moral inversion that had allowed him to rationalize systematic child abuse as educational advancement. He spoke about the necessity of breaking down corrupted personality structures and rebuilding moral frameworks from the ground up, as if describing legitimate medical procedures rather than psychological torture. When Hartwell insisted on immediate access to the underground chambers, Dr. Whitmore's response was to summon several staff members and older students to prevent the inspection. The confrontation escalated when the inspector realized that he was facing organized resistance from people who'd been conditioned to view his intervention as a threat to their educational mission. The battle for access to the underground chambers became a test of wills between legitimate territorial authority and isolated community that had been systematically conditioned to view Dr. Whitmore's word as absolute law. The staff members who responded to his summons displayed the same mechanical obedience that characterized the students, following orders without question or moral consideration. It was Timothy Morrison who ultimately provided the key to resolving the standoff. The boy's complete psychological conditioning had eliminated his ability to recognize the difference between legitimate and illegitimate authority. When Hartwell ordered him to show the way to the underground chambers, Timothy complied with the same emotionless efficiency he displayed throughout their conversation. The descent into the Sut, Whitmore School's underground complex, marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing investigations in territorial history. What Thomas Hartwell discovered in those chambers would force him to confront the absolute limits of human cruelty disguised as educational advancement. Descent into the Chambers. The narrow staircase leading beneath the Whitmore School descended into darkness that seemed to swallow the light from Thomas Hartwell's lantern. Timothy Morrison led the way with the mechanical precision that characterized all his movements, navigating the underground passages with the familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time in these chambers. The first thing that struck Hartwell was the smell, a combination of carbolic acid, human waste, and something else that he couldn't immediately identify, but that filled him with instinctive revulsion. The air was thick with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that suggested confined spaces and human suffering. The underground complex was far more extensive than anything suggested by the school's official records. The main corridor stretched for over 100 feet, with branching passages that led to chambers designed for different aspects of Dr. Whitmore's educational experiments. The construction was professional quality, with stone walls, proper drainage, and electrical lighting that indicated significant investment in creating a permanent facility. Timothy's tour of the underground chambers was delivered with the same emotionless precision that characterized all his communication. He explained each room's function as if describing the features of a conventional school building, showing no recognition of the horror that surrounded them. "This is the primary purification chamber," Timothy announced, opening a heavy wooden door to reveal a room that made Hartwell's stomach turn. "Students who display initial resistance to moral instruction are brought here for personality assessment and preliminary treatment. The restraining equipment allows for extended sessions without risk of self-injury, while the observation platform enables Dr. Whitmore to monitor psychological responses and adjust treatment protocols accordingly." The chamber contained furniture that belonged in no legitimate educational facility. Restraining chairs designed to immobilize struggling subjects, observation equipment that would allow detailed monitoring of psychological torture and recording, devices that suggested systematic documentation of the abuse that occurred here. The walls were lined with soundproofing materials that would prevent screams from reaching the surface, while drainage channels indicated that the room was designed to accommodate whatever bodily fluids might result from extended torture sessions. But it was the scientific precision of the setup that made the chamber particularly disturbing. This wasn't the haphazard brutality of a sadistic individual, but the carefully planned facility of someone who'd approached psychological torture with the same methodical attention to detail that universities applied to their research laboratories. Timothy's explanation of the chamber's function revealed the systematic nature of Dr. Whitmore's abuse. Students who showed signs of homesickness, disobedience, or attachment to their previous lives were subjected to moral realignment therapy. That continued until these problematic behaviors were eliminated. The process was described as necessary for their educational development and ultimate benefit. The next chamber was even more disturbing. Timothy explained that it was used for advanced personality reconstruction, a process that involved the complete elimination of existing psychological patterns and their replacement with new behavioral frameworks designed by Dr. Whitmore. The equipment here was more sophisticated, including devices that could deliver precisely controlled electrical stimulation and sensory deprivation chambers that could break down psychological resistance through isolation and disorientation. Students who require intensive moral reconstruction are brought here for extended treatment, Timothy explained with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used throughout the tour. The process involves the systematic removal of corrupted personality, structures through a combination of sensory manipulation, memory realignment, and behavioral conditioning. I underwent this treatment during my second year at the school and can now assist Dr. Whitmore in its application to other students. The casual way Timothy described his own psychological torture was more disturbing than any display of trauma would have been. The boy's complete lack of emotional response to the description of systematic abuse indicated that Dr. Whitmore's methods had been successful in eliminating normal human psychological responses. The third chamber contained what Timothy called the graduation facility, a room designed for students who had completed their psychological reconstruction and were ready to assist in the treatment of newer arrivals. The equipment here was less focused on restraint and more on psychological manipulation, including devices that could create disorienting sensory experiences and recording equipment that would allow the documentation of each student's complete psychological breakdown. It was in this chamber that Hartwell found the first direct evidence of the missing students who'd been reported to territorial authorities. A ledger book contained detailed records of each child's educational progress through the various stages of psychological torture. The entries were written in Dr. Whitmore's precise handwriting and documented the systematic destruction of human personality with clinical detachment. The records revealed that 23 children had been subjected to what Dr. Whitmore called complete moral reconstruction, a process that involved the total elimination of their original personality and its replacement with behavioral patterns designed to serve the school's educational objectives. The final entry for each of these students indicated that they'd achieved educational completion and been transferred to advanced service roles. When Hartwell asked Timothy to explain what advanced service roles meant, the boy's response revealed the ultimate horror of Dr. Whitmore's educational philosophy. Students who'd undergone complete psychological reconstruction were used as assistants in the treatment of newer arrivals, helping to implement the same torture techniques that had been used to destroy their own personalities. Students who achieve educational completion are given the privilege of assisting Dr. Whitmore in the moral instruction of others, Timothy explained. They help implement treatment protocols, monitor psychological responses, and ensure that newer students understand the benefits of cooperation with the educational process. Their experience with moral reconstruction makes them valuable assistants in helping other students achieve similar psychological development. The revelation that psychologically destroyed children were being used as instruments of torture against newer victims represented the ultimate perversion of Dr. Whitmore's educational philosophy. He'd created a system where his victims became participants in their own continued abuse, using their psychological damage as a tool for inflicting similar trauma on others. The final chamber was the most disturbing of all. Timothy explained that it was used for terminal education, a process applied to students who proved resistant to conventional moral reconstruction techniques. The equipment here was designed not just to break down psychological resistance, but to push subjects to the absolute limits of human endurance. Some students display personality structures that are too corrupted to respond to standard treatment, Timothy explained with the same emotionless precision he'd used throughout the tour. These subjects require terminal education to prevent their contamination from spreading to other students. The process ensures that their psychological corruption is completely eliminated, though it sometimes results in what Dr. Whitmore calls educational completion beyond recovery. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Timothy was describing. The terminal education chamber was designed for psychological torture, so extreme that it resulted in complete mental breakdown or death. Students who couldn't be broken down and rebuilt according to Dr. Whitmore's specifications were simply destroyed rather than being allowed to contaminate others with their resistance to his educational methods. The evidence in this final chamber included detailed documentation of the 23 students who'd undergone terminal education over the past 3 years. Dr. Whitmore's records described each case with clinical precision, noting the specific techniques used, the duration of treatment, and the final outcome. The matter-of-fact tone of these records made them even more disturbing than emotional accounts of the torture would have been. As Hartwell examined the documentation of systematic child abuse, he realized that he was dealing with something far more serious than educational misconduct. The Whitmore School had been operating as a laboratory for human experimentation, using orphaned children as test subjects for psychological torture techniques that had no legitimate educational purpose. The scope of the abuse was staggering. Over the course of 4 years, Dr. Whitmore had subjected nearly 80 children to varying degrees of psychological torture, systematically destroying their personalities and rebuilding them according to his specifications. The students who survived. The process had been transformed into extensions of his will, incapable of independent thought or emotional response. But it was the scientific precision of the abuse that made it particularly disturbing. This wasn't the random brutality of a sadistic individual, but the carefully planned research program of someone who'd approached psychological torture with the same methodical attention to detail that legitimate researchers applied to their work. Timothy's tour of the underground chambers concluded with a visit to Dr. Whitmore's private office, a room that contained the complete documentation of his educational experiments. The records found here would provide territorial authorities with detailed evidence of systematic child abuse that had been conducted under the guise of advanced educational methodology. The office contained thousands of pages of documentation, including detailed psychological profiles of each student, treatment protocols for different types of moral reconstruction, and theoretical papers outlining Dr. Whitmore's educational philosophy. The material revealed a mind that had completely abandoned any pretense of moral restraint in pursuit of what he believed was scientific advancement. But it was the final set of documents that revealed the true scope of Dr. Whitmore's crimes. Hidden in a locked drawer were correspondence with other isolated educational institutions throughout the Western Territories, suggesting that the Whitmore School might not have been unique in its methods. The letters discussed techniques for psychological manipulation, methods for maintaining secrecy, and theoretical frameworks for justifying extreme educational measures. The correspondence indicated that Dr. Whitmore had been part of a network of educators who'd rejected conventional teaching methods in favor of what they called reconstructive pedagogy, a system that viewed children as raw material to be shaped according to their specifications rather than as individuals with inherent dignity and rights. As Thomas Hartwell examined the evidence of systematic child abuse, he realized that his investigation had uncovered something far more significant than a single case of educational misconduct. The Whitmore School represented a systematic approach to psychological torture that had been developed and refined over years of experimentation on vulnerable children. The question that remained was what had happened to Dr. Whitmore and the staff members who'd assisted in his crimes. The school had been abandoned when Hartwell arrived, with no sign of the people who'd been operating it just days before. The underground chambers showed evidence of recent use, but all the perpetrators had vanished as completely as the students who'd undergone terminal education. The the confrontation that would determine the fate of the Whitmore School began when Thomas Hartwell emerged from the underground chambers with evidence that could no longer be dismissed as educational misconduct. The systematic torture he'd witnessed, documented with clinical precision in Dr. Whitmore's records, represented crimes that demanded immediate action from territorial authorities. But as Hartwell prepared to place Dr. Whitmore under arrest, he discovered that the headmaster had no intention of submitting to territorial justice. The man who'd spent 4 years perfecting techniques for psychological manipulation wasn't about to allow his work to be interrupted by outside interference. The school's main building had been transformed during Hartwell's underground investigation. Staff members and older students had barricaded the exits and taken positions that would allow them to prevent his departure. The mechanical obedience that had been drilled into them through systematic psychological conditioning made them perfect. Instruments for Dr. Whitmore's final experiment, a test of whether his educational methods could overcome the authority of territorial law. Dr. Whitmore's appearance when Hartwell returned to the surface revealed the complete abandonment of his facade of educational respectability. The man who'd greeted the inspector with professional courtesy 2 days earlier had been replaced by someone who radiated the fanatic certainty of a true believer facing the ultimate test of his convictions. "Inspector Hartwell," Dr. Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a professor delivering a lecture. "I understand that you've completed your examination of our advanced educational facilities. I trust you've gained an appreciation for the innovative methods we've developed to address the unique challenges of educating children who've been damaged by abandonment and neglect." The headmaster's casual reference to his torture chambers as educational facilities revealed the complete moral inversion that had allowed him to rationalize systematic child abuse as pedagogical advancement. He spoke about the necessity of breaking down corrupted personality structures and rebuilding moral frameworks from the ground up, as if describing legitimate medical procedures rather than psychological torture. Hartwell's response was to inform Dr. Whitmore that he was under arrest for multiple counts of child abuse and would be transported to Helena for trial. The headmaster's reaction revealed the depth of his delusion about the legitimacy of his educational methods. "You misunderstand the nature of our work here," Whitmore replied, his tone carrying the patient condescension of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "What you've witnessed in our purification chambers isn't abuse. It's the most advanced form of moral education ever developed. These children were human refuse before they arrived at our institution. We're not harming them. We're saving them from the psychological damage that would have made them criminals or deviants if left untreated." The confrontation between inspector and headmaster became a philosophical debate about the nature of education and the limits of acceptable methods for shaping human behavior. Dr. Whitmore's justification for his crimes revealed a mind that had completely abandoned any recognition of human dignity in pursuit of what he believed was scientific advancement. Traditional educational methods assume a foundation of moral development that simply doesn't exist in subjects who've been damaged by abandonment, abuse, or exposure to criminal environments. Whitmore explained with the pedantic precision of a professor defending his research. "Our techniques are designed to address these fundamental deficiencies by removing corrupted psychological patterns and replacing them with properly ordered moral frameworks." The headmaster's defense of his methods was supported by the staff members and older students who'd been conditioned to view his authority as absolute. They listened to his explanation of the educational value of psychological torture with the same unquestioning acceptance they displayed throughout their time at the school. But it was Timothy Morrison's intervention that revealed the true horror of Dr. Whitmore's educational philosophy. The boy who'd been completely psychologically reconstructed according to the headmaster's specifications stepped forward to provide testimony about the benefits of the treatment he'd received. "Dr. Whitmore saved me from the corruption that would have destroyed my moral development," Timothy announced with the same emotionless precision that characterized all his communication. "Before I underwent purification, I was contaminated by attachments to my previous life that prevented proper educational progress. The process of moral reconstruction eliminated these problematic psychological patterns and replaced them with properly ordered behavioral frameworks that allow me to serve the educational mission of this institution." The boy's testimony served as a horrifying demonstration of Dr. Whitmore's success in completely destroying human personality. Timothy spoke about his own psychological torture with a detached appreciation of someone describing a beneficial medical procedure. The complete absence of normal emotional response to trauma indicated that whatever had been done to him in the underground chambers had eliminated his capacity for independent thought or feeling. Inspector Hartwell's response to Timothy's testimony was to draw his service revolver and inform Dr. Whitmore that he was placing him under immediate arrest. The headmaster's reaction revealed the depth of his delusion about his immunity from territorial law. "You cannot arrest me for conducting legitimate educational research," Whitmore declared, his voice carrying the arrogant certainty of someone who'd convinced himself that his crimes were justified by their scientific value. "The territorial government specifically authorized me to develop innovative methods for educating damaged children. Every technique we've employed has been necessary for the moral development of our students." The confrontation escalated when Dr. Whitmore signaled to his staff and conditioned students to prevent Inspector Hartwell from leaving with evidence of the crimes. The mechanical obedience that had been drilled into them through systematic psychological conditioning made them perfect instruments for implementing the headmaster's will. But the resistance collapsed when several younger students, who'd been hidden in the main building during the underground investigation, began displaying the psychological symptoms that indicated recent torture. These children, unlike Timothy Morrison and the other completely conditioned subjects, still retained enough human response to show distress at the memory of their treatment. The sight of trembling, traumatized children who bore the physical and psychological marks of systematic abuse provided undeniable evidence of the crimes that had been committed under the guise of education. Even the staff members who'd been prepared to resist territorial authority found their conditioning inadequate to overcome the reality of what they'd participated in. Dr. Whitmore's final attempt to justify his methods came in the form of a rambling lecture about the necessity of his work and the ingratitude of a society that couldn't appreciate his educational innovations. His complete disconnection from moral reality was revealed in his insistence that the traumatized children were displaying temporary adjustment difficulties that would resolve once their moral reconstruction was completed. The arrest of Dr. Cornelius Whitmore marked the end of one of the most disturbing cases in territorial history. But the investigation that followed would reveal that the Whitmore School represented only one node in a network of isolated institutions where similar experiments had been conducted on vulnerable children throughout the Western Territories. The AFD as territorial government's response to the Whitmore School investigation was swift and decisive. Within days of Inspector Hartwell's report reaching Helena, medical personnel and additional investigators were dispatched to the remote facility to document the full extent of the crimes and provide care for the surviving children. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, the physician whose earlier report had triggered the investigation, led the medical team that examined the survivors. Her findings revealed psychological damage so severe that many of the children would require years of treatment to recover even basic emotional responses. The students who'd undergone Dr. Whitmore's complete moral reconstruction showed symptoms that were unprecedented in medical literature: systematic elimination of personality traits that psychologists had previously assumed were fundamental to human nature. The most disturbing discovery was that several of the children who'd been most thoroughly conditioned were incapable of recognizing their treatment as abuse. They continued to defend Dr. Whitmore's methods and insisted that their psychological torture had been beneficial for their moral development. The complete inversion of normal psychological responses indicated that the damage might be irreversible. Timothy Morrison's case became the subject of intensive study by territorial medical authorities. The boy who'd served as Inspector Hartwell's guide through the underground chambers displayed psychological symptoms that defied conventional understanding of human behavior. His complete lack of emotional response to trauma, combined with his mechanical obedience to authority, suggested that Dr. Whitmore's techniques had achieved their goal of creating human beings who function more like sophisticated machines than independent individuals. The investigation of Dr. Whitmore's records revealed the existence of detailed correspondence with other isolated educational institutions throughout the Western Territories. The letters discussed techniques for psychological manipulation, methods for maintaining secrecy, and theoretical frameworks for justifying extreme educational measures. The network of educators who'd rejected conventional teaching methods in favor of reconstructive pedagogy was larger than anyone had suspected. Territorial authorities launched immediate investigations of the other institutions mentioned in Dr. Whitmore's correspondence. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The Whitmore School was not unique in its methods. Remote boarding schools, orphanages, and reform institutions throughout the region had been conducting similar experiments on vulnerable children, using isolation and official authority to conceal systematic abuse. The scope of the abuse was staggering. Over a dozen institutions were found to be operating programs that involved psychological torture of children under the guise of advanced educational methodology. The total number of victims was estimated at over 300 children, most of whom had been so thoroughly psychologically damaged that they could never fully recover. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the fact that many of the perpetrators had fled their institutions when news of the Whitmore investigation became public. Dr. Whitmore himself was found dead in his cell 3 days after his arrest, apparently having taken his own life rather than face trial for his crimes. His final statement, left in the form of a detailed confession, showed no remorse for his actions and continued to justify his methods as necessary for the advancement of educational science. The surviving staff members and older students who'd been conditioned to assist in the abuse presented unique challenges for the territorial justice system. Their psychological conditioning made them unable to recognize the illegality of their actions, while their complete obedience to Dr. Whitmore's authority meant they'd participated in crimes without understanding their moral implications. The decision to treat these individuals as victims rather than perpetrators reflected the unprecedented nature of the case. Territorial authorities recognized that people who'd been psychologically conditioned to participate in systematic abuse couldn't be held fully responsible for their actions. The legal precedent established by the Whitmore case would influence how similar cases were handled for decades to come. The children who survived the Whitmore School and similar institutions were placed in legitimate orphanages and foster homes throughout the territory. However, their psychological damage made normal placement impossible in many cases. Special facilities had to be established to provide intensive treatment for children who'd been so thoroughly traumatized that they couldn't function in conventional family environments. The most tragic cases were the children who'd undergone complete psychological reconstruction. These individuals, like Timothy Morrison, had been so thoroughly conditioned that they were incapable of forming normal human relationships or experiencing natural emotional responses. They required lifelong care in specialized institutions designed to accommodate their unique psychological needs. The territorial government's response to the scandal was to implement comprehensive reforms of the educational system. New regulations required regular inspections of all boarding schools and orphanages, with particular attention to institutions that served vulnerable populations. The isolation that had allowed the Whitmore School to operate without oversight was eliminated through requirements for regular communication with territorial authorities. But the most significant change was the recognition that children had inherent rights that couldn't be violated regardless of their circumstances. The legal framework that had allowed institutions to exercise unlimited authority over orphaned and abandoned children was reformed to include protections against abuse and requirements for humane treatment. The Whitmore School itself was declared unsuitable for human habitation and sealed indefinitely. The underground chambers where Dr. Whitmore had conducted his experiments were filled with concrete to prevent any future access. The main building was abandoned and left to decay, serving as a monument to the horrors that had been committed. In the name of educational advancement, the sealed Arisaore, the Vainhays, the Maze, territorial government's decision to seal all records related to the Whitmore School investigation for 80 years reflected the unprecedented nature of the case and the potential for the information to cause additional harm. The detailed documentation of systematic child abuse, including Dr. Whitmore's clinical records and photographic evidence of the underground chambers, was considered too disturbing for public consumption. The sealed records included over 10,000 pages of documentation, including Dr. Whitmore's complete journals detailing his experimental methods and theoretical justifications, medical records of all students who underwent moral reconstruction, correspondence with other institutions conducting similar experiments detailed, plans and photographs of the underground torture chambers, testimony from survivors who retained enough psychological function to provide coherent accounts, investigation reports from territorial authorities documenting the full scope of the abuse. The decision to classify this material reflected concerns about several factors. First, the graphic nature of the documentation could potentially traumatize readers who weren't prepared for such extreme accounts of child abuse. Second, the detailed descriptions of psychological torture techniques could potentially be misused by individuals seeking to harm children. Finally, the identification of specific victims could cause additional trauma to survivors who were attempting to rebuild their lives. The sealed records also contained information about the network of similar institutions that had been operating throughout the Western Territories. The complete exposure of this network would have revealed that the systematic abuse of children under the guise of education was far more widespread than the public realized. Territorial authorities made the decision to handle these cases quietly to prevent panic and protect the privacy of additional victims. The most sensitive portion of the sealed records dealt with the fate of the children who'd undergone complete psychological reconstruction. These individuals, who'd been so thoroughly conditioned that they could never fully recover, presented ongoing challenges for territorial authorities. The records documented the establishment of specialized facilities designed to provide lifelong care for these victims, along with detailed medical studies attempting to understand the long-term effects of extreme psychological trauma. Dr. Whitmore's final confession, written in his cell during the 3 days before his suicide, provided the most disturbing insights into his motivations and methods. The document revealed a mind that had completely abandoned any recognition of human dignity in pursuit of what he believed was scientific advancement. His justification for systematic child abuse as necessary for moral development showed no understanding of the criminal nature of his actions. The confession also contained detailed descriptions of the theoretical framework that had guided his experiments. Dr. Whitmore had convinced himself that conventional notions of individual rights and human dignity were obstacles to proper educational development. His methods were designed to eliminate these corrupted psychological patterns and replace them with behavioral frameworks that would create more productive and obedient citizens. The most chilling aspect of the confession was its complete lack of remorse. Dr. Whitmore continued to defend his methods even while acknowledging that they had resulted in the psychological destruction of dozens of children. He viewed his work as a necessary contribution to educational science that would eventually be recognized as a breakthrough in human development. The sealed records were finally opened in 1971, 80 years after the original investigation. The release of the documents confirmed many of the rumors and legends that had grown up around the Whitmore School, while revealing details that were even more disturbing than the public had imagined. The opening of the records coincided with renewed interest in the case from historians and psychologists studying the history of child abuse and institutional violence. The detailed documentation of Dr. Whitmore's methods provided unprecedented insights into the systematic application of psychological torture and its effects on human development. Modern psychological analysis of the case revealed that Dr. Whitmore's techniques had achieved exactly what he'd intended: the complete destruction of individual personality and its replacement with artificial behavioral patterns. The children who'd survived complete moral reconstruction had been transformed into human beings who functioned more like sophisticated machines than independent individuals. The case became a landmark in the study of extreme psychological trauma and the limits of human resilience. The documentation of systematic personality destruction provided researchers with detailed evidence of how human consciousness could be systematically dismantled through the application of precisely calibrated psychological pressure. But the most significant impact of the opened records was the recognition that the Whitmore School represented a systematic approach to child abuse that had been far more widespread than previously understood. The network of institutions conducting similar experiments had included some of the most respected educational facilities in the Western Territories, suggesting that the abuse of vulnerable children had been normalized within certain educational circles. The Legacy the Whitmore Charity School incident became a defining moment in the history of child protection and educational reform. The case demonstrated that systematic abuse could be conducted under the guise of legitimate educational methodology, and that isolation and official authority could be used to conceal crimes against vulnerable populations. The legal precedents established by the territorial government's response to the case influenced child protection laws throughout the United States. The recognition that children had inherent rights that couldn't be violated, regardless of their circumstances, became a fundamental principle of modern child welfare legislation. The psychological insights gained from studying the survivors of Dr. Whitmore's experiments contributed to the development of modern trauma therapy and the understanding of how extreme abuse affects human development. The case provided detailed documentation of the systematic destruction of human personality and the long-term effects of psychological torture on children. The Whitmore School itself became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of transparency in institutions serving vulnerable populations. The sealed building, gradually reclaimed by the Montana wilderness, served as a physical reminder of the horrors that had been committed in the name of educational advancement. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the recognition that the systematic abuse of children could be disguised as legitimate educational methodology. The sophisticated theoretical framework that Dr. Whitmore had developed to justify his crimes demonstrated that academic credentials and scientific language could be used to rationalize the most extreme forms of human cruelty. The survivors of the Whitmore School and similar institutions faced lifelong challenges in recovering from their trauma. Many never achieved full psychological recovery, requiring specialized care throughout their lives. The children who'd undergone complete moral reconstruction remained permanently damaged, their original personalities destroyed beyond any possibility of restoration. Timothy Morrison, the boy who'd served as Inspector Hartwell's guide through the underground chambers, became a case study in the complete destruction of human personality. He lived the remainder of his life in a specialized facility, displaying no emotional responses and following instructions with mechanical precision until his death in 1943. His case provided researchers with detailed documentation of what happened when Dr. Whitmore's techniques achieved their intended goal. The network of institutions conducting similar experiments was eventually dismantled through the investigations that followed the Whitmore case. However, the revelation that such systematic abuse had been conducted under official authority raised questions about how many other cases might have gone undetected. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of orphaned and abandoned children to institutional abuse. The lack of family connections and outside oversight had made these children perfect victims for educators, who viewed them as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving of protection and care. The reforms implemented in response to the Whitmore case established the foundation for modern child protection systems. The requirements for regular inspections, mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, and legal protections for children's rights can be traced directly to the lessons learned from Dr. Whitmore's crimes. Today, the site of the Whitmore Charity School for Orphan Children remains sealed and abandoned. The underground chambers, where systematic psychological torture was conducted as educational methodology, are filled with concrete, but the surface buildings stand as a monument to one of the darkest chapters in American educational history. The case serves as a permanent reminder that the abuse of children can be disguised as legitimate educational methodology, and that the most extreme forms of cruelty can be rationalized through sophisticated theoretical frameworks. The victims of Dr. Whitmore's experiments paid the ultimate price for society's failure to protect vulnerable children from those who would exploit their powerlessness for personal or professional gain. The Whitmore School incident stands as testimony to the importance of transparency, accountability, and the recognition that no educational or therapeutic goal can justify the systematic destruction of human dignity. The sealed records, finally opened after 80 years, continue to provide insights into the darkest possibilities of human behavior and the critical importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, the true horror of the Whitmore Charity School lay not in the physical abuse that occurred within its walls, but in the complete moral inversion that allowed systematic child torture to be presented as educational advancement. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore's legacy serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the critical importance of maintaining human dignity, even in the pursuit of what may seem like noble goals. The children who suffered and died in the underground chambers of the Whitmore School deserve to be remembered not as experimental subjects or educational failures, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by adults who had abandoned their most basic moral responsibilities. Their story serves as a call to vigilance in protecting the vulnerable and a reminder that true education builds up human dignity rather than destroying it.